Let's take a look at one of the ways we can classify triangles. One of the ways we can classify triangles is by looking at the number of sides that are the same length, the number of sides that are congruent. Here we have 3 triangles. Now let's take a look at how we can classify each of these. If we take a look at this first triangle, this triangle is an equilateral triangle. So let's take a closer look at this triangle and see what it means for a triangle to be an equilateral triangle. Again, here we're classifying triangles by the number of sides that are congruent, the number of sides that measure the same length. Well, take a look at the sides in this triangle. They all measure the same. This side measures 5 units, this side measures 5 units, and this side measures 5 units. All those sides are the same length. They're all congruent. So we can say this: side JK is congruent to side JL, which is congruent to side KL. All the sides measure the same. This symbol means congruent to. So here we're saying that all those side lengths are the same. So a triangle where all the sides measure the same is called an equilateral triangle. And take a look at those interior angles. They all measure the same as well. Each angle measures 60 degrees. So we can say this: angle J is congruent to angle K, which is congruent to angle L. Each of those angles measure the same. So when we see a triangle where all the sides measure the same and all the interior angles measure the same, we're looking at an equilateral triangle. And actually, with an equilateral triangle, each of the interior angles will always measure 60 degrees. Think about it. With a triangle, the interior angles always add up to 180 degrees. And with an equilateral triangle, we need to split that 180 degrees equally among 3 angles. If we take 180 divided by 3, we get 60. So in an equilateral triangle, each angle must measure 60 degrees. So here we have an example of an equilateral triangle. Now let's take a look at our second triangle. This second triangle is called an isosceles triangle. So let's take a look at those sides and see if we can figure out what makes a triangle an isosceles triangle. Again, with these classifications, we're looking to see how many sides are congruent, how many sides measure the same. Here we can see this side measures 7 units, this side measures 7 units, and this side measures 9 units. So here we can see 2 sides measure the same. We have 2 congruent sides. Side MN is congruent to side MO. But those sides are not congruent to NO because that side has a different length. So it looks like an isosceles triangle is a triangle where at least 2 sides measure the same. That's exactly what an isosceles triangle is. And in a triangle, if we have 2 sides measuring the same, that means we also have 2 angles measuring the same as well. And we can see that. These 2 angles measure 50 degrees, and the other one measures 80 degrees. So we have 2 angles that measure the same. Angle N and angle O are congruent. They have the same measurement. And those congruent angles will always sit opposite the sides that are congruent to one another. Neat. So an isosceles triangle is a triangle where at least 2 sides are congruent. Well, if we take a look back at an equilateral triangle has at least 2 sides that are congruent. It just happens that the third side is also congruent to the other 2. So an equilateral triangle is a special kind of isosceles triangle where all 3 sides are congruent. Okay, time to take a look at our last triangle. This third type of triangle is called a scaling triangle. So let's take a look at the sides of this triangle and see if we can figure out what makes it a scaling triangle. Well, again, we're looking for the congruent sides, the sides that measure the same. This side measures 15 units, this side measures 6 units, and this side measures 19 units. Hey, none of those sides are congruent. That's what it means to be a scaling triangle. With a scaling triangle, we don't have any sides that are congruent. None of the sides measure the same. And if none of the sides measure the same, that means none of the angles will measure the same as well. So we have no congruent sides and no congruent angles. That's what it means to be a scaling triangle. Neat. So now we know how to classify triangles based on the number of sides that are congruent. If we have a triangle where all three sides are congruent, then we have an equilateral triangle. A triangle where two sides measure the same is called an isosceles triangle. And if we have a triangle that has no congruent sides, then it's called a scaling triangle.